What's up, readers? I'm Adam, aka A Dude Who Reads, and this is a reading vlog for Gardens of the Moon, Malazan Book of the Fallen, Volume 1. And what you're about to watch is me going through this book and reacting to different parts of it and giving you my opinions. It's gonna be part reading vlog, part review, and I'll be honest with you guys, I'm recording this intro after I've already done the reading vlog, and that's because I had a really hard time figuring out what this was going to be. I wasn't sure exactly what format to use for this vlog, and so I had started out by doing sort of a synopsis of all the different parts that I read, and I was going to list this as a video that was full of spoilers, and it was going to kind of be my opportunity to kind of track my reading progress. The problem is, even I was getting bored rewatching that video, and so I decided instead that instead of going through the direction of plot synopses, it might be a little bit more interesting just to give my real-time reactions to the book as I was reading it, as I was going through what I liked, what I didn't like. And so the end result, like I said, is a little bit of a reading vlog, a little bit of a review. It's my first time doing this, so maybe I'm doing it completely wrong, but hey, it's my channel, so I'm doing it the way I want. So like I said, you're about to see my reactions as I go through reading the book real time, how I felt all along. And if you stick around to the end, you'll get to hear what my favorite parts were, what I liked most, what I disliked most about the book, whether or not I'm going to be continuing with the series, and if so, what my plans are to do so, given that many people call this a really heavy read. Now, with that, let's get into the vlog. Okay, so I just finished book 3 of Gardens of the Moon, and I wanted to record some quick thoughts here. I wanted to do this earlier, but I kept getting tripped up because I kept recording the important points in the story as opposed to my thoughts about the story. Which, if you've read Malazan, you probably understand where I'm coming from here. So I'm about halfway through the book at this point, and I gotta say, I really, really wish I had started reading this earlier. I put off reading Malazan for so long because I kept hearing about how dense it was, how complicated it was, how complex the story was, how it required so much focus and what a challenging read it was. And I'm about halfway through Gardens of the Moon, and all I can say is I'm having a blast. I think this is probably the best written fantasy I have read maybe ever. I mean, that's a strong statement to make, especially when I'm talking about book 1 of a 10-volume series, and I'm only halfway through it. But this has really been eye-opening for me. I did not expect that I would enjoy this book this much. I say I regret not starting it earlier because I made the mistake of listening to people who kept telling me how complex this book was. And I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure where that comes from. And there's going to be a lot of people in the comments below who are going to say, are you reading the right book? Because I will be the first to admit, there's a lot going on in the first 200 pages of this book. You get introduced to a lot of new characters, a lot of new places, a lot of new things, religions, magic powers, and the reality is none of it gets explained to you. None of it. And so I'm walking into a brand new world, I'm completely lost, have no footing, and I'm just in the heart of the action, trying to figure out as I go. But the thing is, that's not a bad thing, because the alternative to that is trying to explain every single bit of the story so that I understand what's happening and then letting the story develop afterwards, which would just be boring. So I think what Erickson's doing is actually just good writing. And what people are reacting to when they say this is complex and it's challenging is that Malazan as a universe is just so big that whereas most good writing, when you start in media res, so in the middle of the action, you can pretty quickly pick up what's going on because you're familiar with most of the world, right? Most of the things are things that you know, the things that you can make relations or connections to. When you first get into the Malazan universe, you're in a completely different world. Nothing is the same. the geography isn't the same, you don't know anything about the magic system, you don't know anything about the people, you don't know anything about the politics, you don't know anything about the races. It's all completely new. The history, all of it, right? And so, and this is such a big world that there is so much to unpack that whereas normally you can get your bearings in the first 50 or 100 pages, I wouldn't be surprised if in this case it takes the first few books before you can even get your bearings. And from what I've understood, even that's difficult because you jump around to different storylines and different characters and so on and so forth. But regardless, I am just having such a great time with this. I think Erikson is such a phenomenal writer, and if I'm not mistaken, this is his first, Gardens of the Moon was the first novel he published. That blows my mind. For him to take something this ambitious and do this on his first try is mind-blowing to me. And the other thing that kind of freaks me out is that I have heard from people who enjoy Malazan fans, that Gardens of the Moon is one of the weaker, if not the weakest book in Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is crazy because in the first half of this book, I'm loving this. I'm loving this world. I'm loving these characters. I'm loving the nuance. I'm loving the fact that I'm not being treated like a child who has to have every single thing spoon-fed to me. You know, like some fantasy authors who have to spend the first 100 pages of their book with an explanation about how their magic system works, and then give you appendices with like all of the details so that you can kind of recreate it yourself for your own tabletop gaming purposes or something. I don't know. You know who I'm talking about. But Erikson doesn't do any of that. Erikson just says, this is the world, here's the story, I'm going to start telling you the story and you figure out all the rest as it goes. And I love it. I absolutely love being treated like an adult. Yes, there's a lot to pick up on, but you know what? It's not impossible. And yes, there's a lot of characters, but it's not a crazy number of characters. By the time you're 150 pages in, you've met pretty much all of the characters that are going to appear in the rest of the book. And the reason I know that, not having read the book, is because there's a list of, there's a dramatis personae at the beginning of the book that lists all the characters, and I've encountered pretty much all of them in the first 100 to 150 pages. So up until page 500, when this ends, or whatever it ends at, I already know who these characters are. I have a good feel for them. So it's not like I'm going to be lost up until the very end of the book. So again, I'm just enjoying this book so much, and I'm really sad that I put this off because I was scared. I was scared of this series, and I think I shouldn't have been. So I can't wait to read the second half of this book. I really can't. And if it's anywhere near as good as the first half, then I'm going to be super eager to read book 2. And if book 2 is anywhere near as good as book 1, then I think we've got a new Malazan fan on our hands. Okay, so I'm about 100 pages further along now in Gardens of the Moon, and wow, has this book taken off in the last 100 pages. So nowhere near as many new characters being introduced lately, but there is still a ton of new questions being opened up. New races have been introduced, getting more and more history about the origins of the planet, universe, whatever it is, all of which, if you were reading Gardens of the Moon in 1999, might be easy to skip over. But with the benefit of the series being completed, and me not knowing anything about the series really other than the titles of the subsequent books, already based on those titles, I know that there are things that are getting mentioned in passing in book 1 that will end up being major points in this series down the road. So kudos to Erikson for plotting that far ahead and doing such a masterful job of foreshadowing in such a light way that it doesn't feel intrusive to the story whatsoever. So like I said, the story is really just taken off very light on action, but you can tell that Erikson is just such a master of pacing because the chapters are getting shorter, the sections and scenes within the chapters are getting shorter. I haven't actually measured this, but I would assume probably even the sentence lengths are getting shorter. And so everything is happening quicker and quicker and quicker. and I've still got, I think, close to maybe 200 pages left in the book, but already I can feel that this is building to some sort of climax that I'm assuming is going to happen at some point soon. It is a lot to wrap your head around. I get that. I was trying to summarize the first 3 books or parts of Volume 1, and just trying to summarize all the different character threads and plot lines, and then looking at how they intersect with each other. It is sort of mind-boggling just to summarize this book. I can only imagine what it was like for Erickson to write it. So yeah, 100 pages after my last update, and I am still more impressed than ever by Malazan so far. I don't know what could possibly happen in the last, 100 to 200 pages that are left in this book that would make me think that I will not want to, at the very least, read the next book. And at this point, I'd be very surprised if I am not finishing this series. We'll see. Quick update on Gardens of the Moon. So I went back and I checked the last update that I gave. I was around page 280, which meant that I had about 200 pages left to go in the book. Now I am at page 339, so about 60 pages further along. I have not had as much time to read as I would have liked, but in just those next 60 pages that I've gotten through, the story just keeps going faster and faster, man. It's wild. It's getting crazy. The characters were like, the exposition is starting to come out. Some of the questions are starting to be answered, starting to understand the world a little bit better, starting to get a feel for what a badass some of these characters are, like how ridiculously powerful Anamander Rake really is, how powerful Quick Ben is in comparison to that, how, some of these things are all coming together, these plot lines, these twists, and also a feel for how little some of these, current elements of the story really are, because this is not a story about the characters in this book. This is a much bigger story that goes back to like the beginning of time, and there's something else that is happening here. And it is becoming very clear to me that this is Erickson's way of telling a really broad story using a really micro lens with just a few characters, and do it in such a way that I enjoy the telling of the story, because these characters are so great and their interactions are so great, but really they're not the important part. The characters are awesome, but they don't matter that much to the overall story. At least I don't think they do. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but it seems to me this is a story about gods and about history and about a world, and not so much about individual human beings. I could be completely wrong about this, but that's the sense that I'm getting about this. And what we're seeing here is just how individual human beings get caught up and trapped in this crazy sort of whirlwind of, higher powers, and how, there's only so much control they have over their destiny or their fate. Again, I still got about 150 pages to go here, but that's kind of where I see this is going. And I'm loving this book. I am loving it. I need to find another few hours just to blow through the rest of this, because I had planned on reading book 2 at some point in the next couple months. I'm gonna have to bump that up because I'm enjoying this way too much. I don't think I can wait a few months to read book 2. I'm gonna have to pick it up way sooner than that. So that's it for now, and I will probably check back in either just before I finish or as I finish this book. See you later. Okay, so I'm recording this one from the car, which is a little bit of a weird place to be recording a reading vlog. I recognize that, but I finished chapter 7, or book 7, part 7 of Gardens of the Moon last night in bed, and I wanted to record my thoughts on this before I finish the book, which is probably going to happen today, because for the first time since I started this book, I finally figured out something that I'm not completely over the moon in love with about this book. And I recognize that I'm grasping a little bit, but I wanted to add a little bit of nuance, because I think everything I've said about this book so far has just been so overwhelmingly positive that it can't possibly perfect, right? So here goes. So the one criticism I have of this book, and it's not even a criticism because I think it just needs to be a conscious choice that was made by Erikson, is that now that I am approaching the end of the book, I find myself wishing that I knew the main characters a little bit better. If I compare this book with some of my favorite fantasy written of all time, things like Joe Abercrombie or George R.R. Martin, the difference between their stories and Erikson's story is, one, Erikson is telling a much larger tale, even larger than A Song of Ice and Fire. That much is clear even from book one. But the other difference is, because this tale is so large and because Erikson doesn't limit himself to a few limited POV characters, we get to spend very little time with each of the main players in the story, which means that we don't get to know them as well. And even what happens is, in cases like, for example, there's a scene in part 7 of Gardens of the Moon with Whiskey Jack and the Bridge Burner Squad, where Whiskey Jack, clearly Erikson needs to give some exposition to this character. And so we get this sort of cheesy dialogue between him and I think it's Fiddler, maybe, or one of the other sappers, where there's just this bizarre sort of out of character, out of nowhere speech about the about what it means, sort of the limits of human depravity and that kind of thing, which just kind of appears out of nowhere, which is necessary for you to kind of understand Whiskey Jack's personality, and it helps to clarify some of the decisions he'll make just a few chapters later. But that comes out of nowhere from a character that you almost hear nothing from beforehand, and it makes it so that it's a little bit weird. It's just kind of a little bit out of left field, and it feels a little bit cheesy. Now, that being said, I completely understand why this has to be the case, because in order to tell a story as big as what Erikson is telling in this book, you need to have a lot of various points of view. You can't do this with just 3 or 4 characters, at least not in a way that I've ever seen done well. So you end up with these difficult choices being made where Erikson is deciding that, you know what, I am going to focus on more characters because I need to, in order to move the story along. The side effect of that, though, is the characters that I am going to follow are harder to get to know, because I just don't have that much time to spend with each of them. So that is like my one gripe so far with Gardens of the Moon, that I wish I loved these characters as much as I love a Joe Abercrombie character, but it's just impossible. There's no way that I can fall in love with a Rollick Nom the same way I would fall in love with a Logan Ninefingers when Logan Ninefingers gets a quarter of a 600-page book and Rollick Nom gets, maybe 50 pages in the entirety of Gardens of the Moon. So it's one of those things where choices need to be made. That being said, this is still one of the greatest fantasy novels I've ever read, and I can't wait to finish this probably tonight. All right, talk to you when it's done. Okay, it's done. Gardens of the Moon, Malazan Book of the Fallen, Volume 1, done, dusted, finished, and I want to share my final thoughts on the last section and my thoughts on the book overall with you. So starting with the last 80 pages or so since my last update, this book wrapped up really, really quickly. In fact, I would say it probably wrapped up too quickly. I think that Gardens of the Moon could probably have easily been 25, maybe even 50% longer as a book, and it wouldn't have been a bad thing. Just to give Erikson a chance to unpack some of the plot threads that he had been laying down throughout the entire book. From what I understand, some of the later books actually are 25 to 50% longer, and so it makes me wonder if what I'm seeing here and the issues that I have with some of these plot threads being wrapped up so quickly might not be pressures that an editor put on a first-time writer to say, you're new at this, no one's going to want to read a book that big by an unprotested author, so you're going to need to cut down. And I wonder if a lot of what I would have liked to have seen in the end of this book was actually left on the cutting room floor. And with the later books, maybe Erikson had more freedom because he was a more well-established author, and so he was able to write things more at the pace that he liked. I'm not sure, but either way, clearly there was some stuff that felt a little bit rushed. Case in point, there is one major plot thread that is kind of carried out throughout most of the, 2/3 of the book, I would say, and then it gets wrapped up in like a paragraph so quickly that I had to reread the page where it happened 3 times to make sure that I wasn't missing something, because it felt so quick that it was just a complete unfulfilling end to this sort of threat that had been built up for the entire book. That it was just one of those things where it's like, okay, that's it. We were built up this entire time, and that's all that happens. So, it's one example, but I feel like a lot of the plot threads kind of wrapped up that quickly, which is a little bit unfortunate because I would say up until like the 85% mark of this book, I had 0 complaints about Gardens of the Moon. And then towards the end, it started to feel just a little bit rushed, like we were wrapping things up a little bit too quickly. So that being said, overall, my thoughts on the books. In terms of stuff I liked a little bit less, it's what I just talked about. The ending felt a little bit rushed. It felt like we were building up so much tension and there was so much good plot and story that was building up. And then in the last 80 pages or so, the pace got quick, which I don't mind, but then the wrap up just didn't feel like we were getting the right payout for what we signed up for. The other thing that kind of irked me a little bit, and I alluded to this in one of the previous vlogs, was sometimes it feels like some of the character development is just getting sort of shoehorned in because Erikson feels like he needs to elaborate on some of these characters a little bit more, but he doesn't have enough time to do it because the cast is just so big and the story is just so massive. So you have these character moments that are just sort of sprinkled in, but they don't feel organic. They feel like they've just been kind of shoved in. And so it'll be something along the lines of a character will just have done something incredibly important or impactful or maybe distressing, and throughout the entire thing we don't get too much of a glimpse into what the character's thinking, but after it's over, then we have these 1 or 2 pages of inner monologue where the character is just kind of thinking through what that means for them, which doesn't feel as organic and as impactful as if this had been being developed throughout the actions that are happening within the book. So that and the way that the book wrapped up so quickly would probably be my 2 biggest sort of complaints about the book. That being said, overall, I still really love this book. The things that I love the most about it are probably the things that detractors of Malazan complain about the most. And that is that this world and this story is just so complex and huge that wrapping your head around it takes a lot of effort. Like, Erikson, to me, is probably the best world-building author I have ever read in fantasy, up there with Tolkien. And I say this with all due respect for Brandon Sanderson, who's often held up as the guy who's so great at building these worlds. I don't think Sanderson holds a candle to Erikson when it comes to this. The world of Malazan feels so real and feels so well thought out, with its own history and its own peoples and their own pasts and their own thoughts and histories and politics and all these things that are come wrapped together. The world just feels real. It doesn't feel like someone just invented this out of wholesale cloth. It feels like Erikson went and discovered this place and now he's telling us stories about it. And we only know the tip of the iceberg of what's going on, just as in human history, we only know the tip of the iceberg of what is motivating actions of people around the globe. So to me, the way that Erikson has built this world, built these characters, built this entire sort of mythos is just phenomenal, and it is by far my favorite part of this book, which is a little bit surprising to me because I'm not a reader who generally goes in for setting. I'm not a reader who generally goes in for world building as the thing I'm looking for in my books. I'm usually much more of a character-driven reader. And this book, like I said, has some phenomenal characters, but their development at times feels a little bit rushed. And yet, I would still say this is probably still one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. So kudos to Erikson for finding a way to take the things that I love, doing them decently, but doing other stuff so well that this book is just phenomenal in my mind. And I can't wait to read book 2. Which brings me to the next question, which is, what are my plans for reading the rest of the Malazan series? So as you probably know, if you're watching this video, Malazan Book of the Fallen itself is a 10-book series, and it is part of a larger Malazan world where Erikson writes along with Ian C. Esselmont, and I don't know how many books exist in that universe. But my plan is to start by reading through Malazan Book of the Fallen from beginning to end. Yes, after reading only one book, I am committing to reading all 10 Malazan Book of the Fallens. Unless something happens in like book 3 or 4 where I am just so completely turned off by the series that I have to say, nope, I'm not getting to the end. At this point, I am pretty sure I'm going to be reading Malazan Book of the Fallen all the way through to book 10. Once I get to the end of book 10, I will make a decision at that point whether I want to go back and read everything in the Malazan universe. I don't know if that'll happen. For now, I'm reserving judgment. But as of right now, my plan is to read all 10 Malazan Book of the Fallen. I'm not going to be reading them right away. I'm not going to be reading 9 more Malazan Book of the Fallen books before I read anything else. As you guys may know, if you've seen other videos of mine, I like reading broadly way too much for that. So I'm going to be sprinkling some Malazan Book of the Fallen throughout the rest of my reading, probably averaging about 1 book every couple months. So within the next 2 years or so here, I should have finished the entire series, which may seem slow, may seem fast. Very few people I know blitz through Malazan Book of the Fallen. And so maybe my timeline is actually even a little bit aggressive, but given how much I enjoyed the first book, I don't think it's that much of a stretch. And I think it'll be a good opportunity for me to sort of space it out and enjoy some other stuff, change the flavors up a little bit without getting tired and without sort of feeling like I need a break from the series. So that's my plan right now. Might it change? It might, it could. But as of right now, that's how I feel about Malazan Book of the Fallen and Gardens of the Moon specifically. Like I said, there's some issues with the book, but overall, I am super happy that I read this book, and maybe my one regret is that I didn't read this sooner, because this has been around. This specific book was published 14 years ago, and I've known about it probably for at least, not 14 years ago, my apologies. This book was published 24 years ago. And I have known about it for at least the last 10 or 15, and I haven't read it because I had heard all these things about it being, you know, heavy, about it requiring a whole lot of focus and all this stuff. And honestly, all the things that I heard which kept me from reading it are the exact reasons why I love this so much. So I can't wait to read what's coming up next. And yeah, I will probably do some more videos like this one for the next book. So if you enjoyed this one, subscribe to the channel so you see when the next one shows up. And I would love to hear down in the comments below what your thoughts were on Gardens of the Moon. Do you think I'm crazy? Do you think my opinions hold water? Do you completely disagree with me? Whatever the case might be, let's have that conversation down below in the comments. Until next time, cheers, gang.